Welcome. Thanks for joining me as we continue in this study of the Psalms. It's the 16th day of the month, and so if you're reading through the Psalter in a month, your Psalms to be read today were Psalms 76 to 80. I'm focusing this morning on Psalm 77, and we'll ask our same questions of the Psalm. First question, of course, who is God revealed to be in this Psalm? What attribute, what titles are ascribed to him? And we see several here, though in an unusual context in verse 8 and 9, because he's asking, has God's steadfast love ceased forever? Are his promises at an end? So he knows God to be a God of steadfast love, a covenant God who makes promises to his people. He asks in verse 9, has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? So what he knows to be true of God is he's a gracious God, a compassionate God. He speaks of the right hand of God in verse 10, the power and authority. Verse 14, he adds might of God. He knows that God is holy. He says in verse 13, your way, O God, is holy, which is pure, right, no imperfection, no deviation, entire justice. He is true always. And we see that God is great, that God is mighty overall. We're going to see that mighty work in one particular place and time here. So he knows all these things are to be true of God. And he talks about God's works. Second question, what has God done? What is God doing? Or what will God do? It's almost entirely a look at the past and the previous mighty works of God, the deeds of God. He says in verse 11, I will remember the deeds of the Lord, the wonders of old. I will ponder your work, your mighty deeds, verse 12. Your wonders that you work, verse 14. And your redemption, he says, verse 15, you with your arm redeemed your people. And then he gives a particular illustration of that, one of the great illustrations in the Old Testament of how God delivered his people when their backs were up against the Red Sea and Pharaoh and his army were coming against them, and God in his might and power, this dramatic deliverance that we'll all remember, those of us at least who maybe are my age, remember Charlton Heston standing there at the Red Sea and the waters open and the people go through and then the waters come back and swallow up the enemy. And so verses 16 to 19 is recounting that mighty work of God when he delivered his people. So that's what God has done, and he looks back upon that and remembers it in the midst of a crisis. Because the psalmist is crying aloud to God. Verse 1, this is the third question. What's going on with him? What is his state? It's a day of trouble, verse 2. My soul refuses to be comforted. I moan, verse 3. My spirit faints. He says, verse 4, I'm so troubled I cannot speak. And so it's a time of great distress, sorrow, anxiety, disappointment, worry, fear, doubt. It's a time when these waves of uncertainty are crashing over him, and it seems as if God is not to be found. Why do you allow this to go on, Lord? How long, Lord, is what he's asking here. And he expresses his doubt in 7 to 9. Will this go on forever? Will you shut us out forever? Where are you, God? Well, how does who God is and what God has done come together with where the psalmist is at these days? And it's something that's familiar to us by now. Here's what he does. He says in verse 10, then I said, I will appeal to this. Verse 11, I will remember. Yes, I will remember. Verse 12, I will ponder. I will meditate. So what do you do in those times of uncertainty? You remember. You set your feet on the solid ground of what God has done in the past to give you confidence and a sense of certainty in the present. That's what he does here. And then he comes to this glorious conclusion at the end of the psalm, remembering all these things. Here's what you did, God. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. This is who you are, God. You are our shepherd. You shepherded your people in the past. You will shepherd your people today. And so he ends on a note of confidence here that God is his shepherd, has not abandoned him. It's not completely resolved here. It's still a look basically back, and yet that past informs the present. So what do we do? How does this relate to us? Question 5, what response is expected of us? Well, we are to remember. What do you do in times of difficulty and trial and uncertainty, as if God is nowhere to be found? You remember. That's why some people journal. It's a great practice. And then you can look back and remember times when God was at work. Remember the day of your salvation. Remember the highlights. In the Old Testament, they set down these stones of remembrance to remember times of deliverance and rescue by God. Maybe if you've got extra time today, maybe that's what you should do. Take a piece of paper and remember, and set down these stones of remembrance. Who has God demonstrated himself to be to you in the past? What has God done in the past? Who has God shown himself to be for you in Christ, that you know to be true from your past experience? And then maybe just look at the cross. What did God demonstrate to you about who he is and what he has done for you in Christ on the cross? Write it down and ponder it and meditate on it. And then maybe a third thing you could do, take your favorite promise, whatever it is, whether it's Isaiah 26, or whether it's Philippians 4, or Romans 8:32, probably for me, or I love Zephaniah 3:17. Take your favorite promise and write it out, underline it, mark it, highlight it, ponder it, pray over it, and make it your own again today. So let's do that together. Father, thank you that we can remember. Thank you for the value of memory. Let us never forget. Let us never forget what you've done for us in Christ. Let us never forget the past experiences of richness, the past experiences of salvation and forgiveness and life and prosperity of soul that has come from you. Let us never forget what you've done for us in Christ. And let us be assured today that how is it possible that you, who did not spare your own Son, but gave him up for us all, will you not also with him freely give us all things?